And we would like to welcome everybody who's joining us to the first session of Code Connection. I'm Beth Brotherton, Communications Director and Director of Neighborhood Relations for the City of Greenville, and so excited to be learning more about this process along with the folks who are helping our planning and development team in the rewrite of our development code. And so Code Connection is an opportunity for us to really educate the public, answer questions, kind of go through the process. And I'm going to let the team introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how this process will unroll and the impacts that it will have on our community, because this is really coming out of our GVL 2040 comprehensive plan, where our city council adopted this in early February of 2021, saying these are our priorities. It's one thing to have a vision document. It's another thing to have a code in place to back that document up. So this is GVL 2040 in action by writing this development code. So team, take it away. Thanks so much for providing the information.
Great. Thanks, Beth. I think maybe what I'll do is kind of kick this off. I should note that I'm joined by Charles Buki, a colleague at CZB, Matt Ingalls, colleague with Ingalls Planning and Design, Larry Weston from Weston Consulting, Lee Einsweller, and Christy Dodson from Code Studio. And we will all be available for questions and discussion at the end of this presentation. And so if there are any questions as we walk through this, please don't hesitate to jot them down, throw them, I guess, into the Q&A on the right side. I think that's okay, Beth, and we will address them either as we go or toward the end. Our team was selected by the City of Greenville to write the city's new development code, as Beth noted. And so many of you may know that as the Land Management Ordinance, or the LMO. It is our intent over the course of the next year to rewrite this development code. And we're hoping that through these webinars that we are able to engage all of you, the community, in a way that answers your questions and allows us to get your input. I think I should also note that by way of a little bit of housekeeping, we'll do the webinar monthly. It'll be the second Wednesday of each month, 5 p.m. Eastern, through most of this year. And so any of you that are watching, if you have friends or colleagues or family or others that are interested in what's going on in the community, certainly let them know about this series so they can join in. And we also will be doing a kind of information blast that will be published on the city's website. These are just kind of single page informational items that will be updated approximately twice monthly, discussing everything from what is development, how does it occur, what is a subdivision, how is affordable housing connected to the development code. You'll be able to find these on the city's website. Just navigate to the Planning and Development Department, click the link on the development code, and then the Code Education tab. So with that being said, why don't we move to the next slide? So today's webinar is really intended to explain what is a comprehensive plan, and what is a zoning code. Essentially, we're hoping to make sure that we convey what the differences are between the two. Each has a very different role within the community. I'll walk you through the first few slides that relate to the comprehensive plan before I turn it over to our colleague Christy, who will walk you through the zoning code explanation. Next slide. So essentially, a comprehensive plan has three important components. One is it gets the big things right. It clearly and succinctly identifies what the priorities are for the city. Second component is that it plans for what is known and what is knowable. It uses actionable data to inform strategies. And then thirdly, it provides a framework for addressing the unknown by way of community outreach and input gathering. It outlines the city's values and planning principles, which essentially become the foundation for making decisions when unique or unexpected issues arise or need addressed. Next slide. So there's a few things to know about a comprehensive plan that are quite important. One is that it's not a binding document. In other words, the statute for South Carolina, while it does regulate and mandate that a city complete a comprehensive plan, city is not bound by law to follow the comprehensive plan. And so it's essentially a vision tool and one that contains the goals and priorities. But ultimately, the success of a comprehensive plan is left to the voices of the residents or the planning commission, city staff, the city council, neighborhood entities, and other partner entities. It takes a significant amount of work to move a comprehensive plan forward, and it takes a significant amount of assurances that the right funding is dedicated to those items that are outlined in a comprehensive plan.
You make a good point there, Thomas. I'm going to interrupt you just quickly. That GVL 2040 is a comprehensive plan. It is a vision document, but as you mentioned, it's not binding. And so therefore, we need to take this next step, right? Put this thing into action.
That's right. And that takes efforts from within City Hall, outside City Hall, neighborhood voices, et cetera. So kind of along that line, I think it may be important to let Larry speak a little bit about some of the outreach efforts, the community input efforts that we think are really important to ensuring that the comprehensive plan does become actionable and that there are voices that will be behind the efforts to produce the development code.
Thank you, Thomas. It's important for residents and other community leaders, people in the public, to understand that this is their plan. This is their plan that requires their involvement in order for it to become a reality. There will be legislation that will have to be passed. There will be items, policy items that will have to be voted on, and those who will be doing the voting will look to you, the public, to make sure that that you know what's going on, so that they can vote on your behalf. We'll be doing small area plan meetings. There are 5 small areas in this plan that will each need specific work. We'll be working through those with 5 neighborhoods. In addition to these webinars, there'll be 12 of these webinars. This is the first of 12, and so you'll have lots of opportunities to make input there. And then also there will be, as Thomas mentioned earlier, there will be the blast that will be coming along twice a month. There'll be plenty of opportunities for the public to be involved, and that's why we're taking such pains to make sure that you understand as much as you can about the process. It can look technical at times. I've been on both sides of this. I've been a city planner. I've helped to plan neighborhoods. I've also been a neighborhood advocate and a neighborhood leader that has fought to make sure that those plans are done well and are implemented well. So I do have a sense of what it takes to make plans like this work. And so I'm here to try and make sure that you understand and that we hear you actively, and that we can be as transparent as we can as we go through this process. This is your process. We're here to help enable you to work it through so that Greenville can be all that it wants to be.
Larry, thank you. And Thomas, I know we're going to talk more about those kind of 5 study areas and why we chose those areas and how that piece will work, right?
We will be discussing those down the line, but just since Larry mentioned it, just for clarification so that everybody knows, the 5 areas are essentially a neighborhood, Greater Sullivan neighborhood, the area up at the Stone Avenue and Main intersection, kind of Stone Avenue, Main over to Rutherford, Buncombe. The 3rd area is the Augusta, Potomac, Malden, kind of the intersection down at the southeastern part of the community, McAllister Square and the area around that, and then the North Lawrence Road corridor, basically from McAllister Square up to the downtown area, essentially. And so those are the areas that were selected for some kind of code planning, if you will. We'll be working with some advisory panels in that area. We'll be doing public outreach, and there will be some opportunities to touch base with the residents in those areas. We want to hear from them. We'll have open house opportunities, et cetera. And so those will be launching in early February. So look for that on the calendar as well on the website, because we'll need and hope that we get a significant amount of public input.
And not to get you too far off topic, but these were chosen really because they are kind of good snapshots of other areas of the community. And so they really are testing grounds that are representative of the whole community and things that we would see in other places rather than kind of a pilot program, right?
That's right. So neighborhood planning in Greater Sullivan will have applicability in other neighborhoods throughout the community. The area up at Main and Stone has applicability in other areas throughout the community. So that's exactly right. That is our hope, that we can take what we learn there, kind of spread it around the community, because we can't do every single corner. We can't do every single intersection. So you're exactly right. Beth, you're becoming a pretty good planner, just for the record. You've kind of got it naturally.
Thank you. I'm trying to learn as we go. This stuff is fascinating and important, as you mentioned. While it is sometimes dense, I think breaking it down so everyone in the community understands the implications to them, to their neighbor, to their property, to the future of development, and then our larger community is a big deal.
That's right. Great. Next slide. So as we've outlined, the City Council did adopt GVL 2040 in February of 2021. And so it is a comprehensive plan that is intended to serve the community's needs for a couple of decades. Community input during the comprehensive plan process noted that residents were favorable to seeing growth in the city. They wanted to see development continue. They wanted to see it continue in a way that was equitable, and they wanted it to continue in a way that addressed the three priority issues. So as you can see here, the three priority issues that were outlined as a result of GVL 2040 were open space and the environment. And a measurable outcome for that priority of the comprehensive plan was to preserve 35% of the city's remaining vacant land. The second one was the affordable housing opportunity section, and that was discussed at length with the community, and the hope was to make at least 10% of new housing affordable through incentives and other measures. And then the third one focused on transportation and mobility to ensure that there are alternative and accessible transportation forms throughout the community. These were the three priorities that were discussed with the community, with the steering committee that led the effort, and in conjunction with the Planning Commission and the City Council. Again, that was adopted in February of last year. So the fact that we're now looking to jump into a development code is pretty impressive. Too many cities wait too many years between the guiding document, which is the plan, and this document that we are undertaking this year, which is the development code. And as you can see on this slide, there are a few ways to begin implementing a comprehensive plan, certainly aiming dollars at the priorities that were identified in the comprehensive plan are important. So capital improvement planning and economic development policies that align with the direction of the comprehensive plan is important. And so the middle one, the land use and design regulations component, that's the tool, that's the technical tool. That's the one that we're undertaking this year, the development code. And so as we pursue that, the intent is that that code will address the three priorities outlined slightly differently right below, with housing policy, affordable housing, transportation and infrastructure, the transit mobility options, and then parks and recreation, which also includes open space. As we aim to implement, as we aim to develop a zoning code, we know that there will be the small area plans. We discussed the 5 that are going to be underway immediately, but there will continue to be additional need for small area planning, whether it's very specific transportation planning, it could be other neighborhood planning in different areas throughout the community. Those will continue to be a part of GVL 2040, and they should align with GVL 2040. So those will be efforts that you'll probably be seeing over the course of the next few years. As we go into the next slide, I will turn this over to Christy Dodson, our zoning and design expert, and she will walk you through what is the zoning code.
Thanks, Thomas. So as Thomas really beautifully outlined, that often the idea of a zoning code and a comprehensive plan get sort of combined into one. There's a misunderstanding of what's the planning part and then what's the implementing part. And that's the whole topic of what we're talking about right now. So what is a zoning code? What is the difference? And zoning really is the implementing tool that is going to take the ideas and visions and goals that Greenville set out in GVL 2040, and it implements them into a regulatory framework. So where the comp plan wasn't regulatory, zoning is regulatory. It's the set of rules and regulations of what you can and can't build on a piece of property, of what uses are and aren't allowed. So that's a really fundamental difference, is that zoning is an implementing tool. Next slide, please. So what are the different pieces of the tools? We have one of the primary pieces. Zoning is generally talked about in two components. The first one is the map. So when you are trying to understand a zoning code, and Greenville already has one of these, it's a really great, easily accessible map on the city's website, and we'll be updating that map. And it shows where the different zones or different districts apply throughout the city. It shows how those districts are broken down, and it's specific to each parcel. So each parcel of land has a specific zoning district that it has to adhere to, that the rules of that district are written, and you can find out what district you're in from your zoning map. Next slide, please. And the second part of that is the districts themselves. So the map tells you where the districts are, and the districts themselves tells you what the rules are that you have to follow if you land within that zone. So most fundamentally, a zoning district is going to regulate things like building height or building setbacks. So where a building can and can't land on a site. This example at Main and Stone is a quite urban building, so the building is set close to the street, whereas in a residential district, that building is going to be set a little bit further back. There's going to be a lawn in the front. So your district is going to have those rules, and each district is going to have a different set of rules. So this district here that Main and Stone is in would have a different set of rules than a district that would control a neighborhood character. And some other examples of things that the district rules could include are things that look at how the building and the public realm or the street start to interact with one another. One of the big priorities in Greenville is making sure that your community is walkable, that it has this really beautiful character that you've been able to develop over time in downtown, for example. And so having rules embedded in the district for things like an active ground floor use requirement. So requiring that ground floor has pedestrian amenities or uses that activate that ground floor, or facade transparencies. It's a lot more inviting and welcoming to walk along a building that has windows along the wall than it does a big blank wall. And so putting in place rules like that help support your urban environment. And then things like landscaping requirements. There are really beautiful trees in Greenville, and so making sure that those streetscapes get planted in a way that's consistent and is appropriate for the character of that district. So those are some of the components that are in place in the district rules themselves. And of course, use. Want to be sure to touch on that as well. So what uses are allowed is also part of the district. Next slide, please. So why should I care? And really this touches on a lot of the points that Larry made earlier. So, we as coding and zoning experts can write districts and rules and map them in a lot of different ways. And what we want to make sure, and why you should care about this, even though it is kind of in the nitty gritty of why should I care what my streetscape is or what height my building can be. And really we want to make sure that as we write these districts and as we apply them to the map, that they achieve the goals that you set forth as a community in Greenville 2040. Things like making sure your area's unique character is supported as your community grows, making sure that we protect parks and open space, a really key goal of GVL 2040, making sure uses are compatible and that those incompatible uses aren't adjacent to one another. And then also just fundamentally helping people know what is and isn't permitted in their neighborhood. That can sometimes be a pretty challenging question, and we want to make sure that that is a lot more accessible and easy for anybody to understand what is and isn't allowed on their property. Larry, anything you wanted to add on that?
I would just reinforce what was said earlier. I think this is a good point to do it, that those of us with the technical expertise and with the experience have been chosen by the city to help make what could be a very complicated process understandable. Our job is to do that, and we can do that. We've been trying to do that. We've listened well over the time that the plan was developed. We've been listening ever since, and we intend to make sure that the plan can be understandable. If we think in golfing terms, our job is to tee up the ball so that you can move it down the fairway, or in meal terms that I think everyone can understand. Our job is to set the table and to make sure that you enjoy the best possible meal. We can do that, but we need you to work with us on it, and we need you to help us to implement this as it moves on through the process.
Christy, I think this is an important slide too, because it asks a really, I think, evocative question. Why should I care? I worked in journalism for many years, and every time we pitched a story as a reporter, the boss would always reply before we got to do the story, well, why would anybody care about that? So I think that this key question is something that we need to keep answering for the community throughout this process. Yes, it's a development code. Yes, it's a zoning code. Why should I care? Why should I be involved? Why does this pertain to me? So I think it's great that we have that so early on and help folks recognize that this is a big deal and that they should care.
Yeah, great reminder. And as we really dive into the weeds of this, I would encourage us all as a team to keep reminding each other, this is important, and it is what's going to form the character of your community and the growth moving forward. So it's always a great reminder as we dive into the weeds. And talking about the weeds of what zoning can actually do, we're going to dive into the tools a little bit. And one misconception that I want to break right now is that, zoning can only do one thing. So sometimes people think zoning can only be a tool to preserve areas, or it can only be a tool to facilitate growth. And really what we're creating is a suite of tools that can, for some areas, there's a set of tools that we can create for districts where the zoning may preserve or enhance those areas that the growth is going to be more incremental, it's going to be more gentle. And then there's sort of that in-between scale where we can have zoning districts that allow for some incremental change. And that images that we have here are examples of that already happening along Augusta Road. So incrementally changing these from a more auto-oriented use to a more pedestrian-oriented use just by updating that streetscape. So there are tools in zoning where we can help with that middle scale of growth and change. And then there are areas, maybe in some of the nodes and some of the corridors that want to experience more growth. It's going to be where more of the change happens. And then there's a different set of tools that we can create in zoning that can do that. So really zoning has the capability to span that whole spectrum of scales of development. Next slide, please. So thinking about what some of those tools could be, I broke these apart into a couple different topics. So, zoning isn't just a set of rules that tells you what you can or can't build. It's also a tool that dictates process. So we want to think about the process when an applicant comes in, whether it's a homeowner that just wants to do a little addition to their home, or maybe it's a developer that has a big sizable piece of property that's going to be more significant. We want to make sure that those review and approval processes are streamlined, they're transparent, they're easily understood, that as the applicant comes in, they know how they're going to get from point A to point B from the beginning of the application process through to approval of the project. And so making sure that that review process is very clear is going to be important as we rewrite the code. A big piece of making that happen is making sure that the code is more accessible and user-friendly. You can tell by the graphics, this is an example from a previous community that we've worked in, it may look a little different than what your code looks like today. And the idea of that is that it's graphic, it's organized into tables, so that those outcomes, it's very easily understood. It doesn't take an expert that has years of training or an attorney to figure out what the requirements are. Most people, may take a few minutes to juggle through some of the metrics, but between the graphics and the table, it's fairly easily understood. And that's the idea. With the end result being that the unknowns are reduced. Everyone knows what's expected of them. They know what the development requirements are, and it creates predictable outcomes. So building in some of the priorities and goals from GVL 2040, like good urban form, good urban design, good walkability, building those into requirements for the zoning district means that you're going to have more predictable outcomes ultimately as a community. And that's what we mean by having a by right code, is that, right now there's a lot of design review that has to happen in a lot of areas to achieve the outcomes that are desirable. And so what we're hoping to do is, in some areas, building that into the code so that it's just built in. It's going to happen, it's predictable. And so that's what we mean by that, is building those priorities into the code.
Yeah.
Getting a little bit of feedback.
Yeah, I agree. How close is the document, do you think?
Hey, Matt, will you meet? Thanks. Awesome. Moving on to public realm standards. So this is another, we have a set of tools where we're going to think about process and making that clear, transparent, understandable. We're also going to have a set of tools that are more of the district regulations themselves that deal with the public realm, the public standards. And so that really has to do with that space between the street or the curb and the building. And it's in that space that really is going to achieve a lot of those goals of open space, of walkability, that are already achieved in places like downtown Greenville. I love these two examples, the Village of West Greenville and then Main Street. I think it really embodies what some of the goals are of good public realm standards. So it's looking at streetscapes, green infrastructure, making sure that those are built into the districts. Landscaping and buffering, especially for parking lots. Walking by a parking lot with nice landscaping is different than walking by a parking lot that has a lot of cars sitting right up against you as you walk down the sidewalk. And then enhanced pedestrian access and driveway standards. These are pretty wonky things, but they make a difference and people notice them. Just the everyday person walking, shopping along a district, you feel that difference when you have good standards in these developments. And then open space standards, making sure that we incentivize open space, like this Village of West Greenville Plaza. It's a really beautiful example, and we want to make sure we incentivize that type of improvement in other places. And then right-sizing parking, making sure we get that balance right, and not requiring too much parking, but making sure there's enough, making sure that land is used in a way that makes sense for the market. And then finally, getting into the building and uses itself. So, we've kind of talked about the process, we talked about the site, and then getting into the actual bulk and mass of the building. So we're going to be thinking about bulking and massing standards, both in areas of growth. So those are your nodes and corridors. And then there's going to be a different set of standards, but we're still going to make sure that we have those enhanced standards for the bulk, massing, and form for neighborhoods. And then, of course, a big point for Greenville is making sure that that transition between those scales, that we have a good set of rules for how those scales transition from the growth areas to the neighborhoods, that that's sensitive and appropriate. And then we want to make sure that we have districts and a set of tools for housing options. Affordable housing is one of the key goals of GVL 2040. And so thinking about building districts that could allow some of those neighborhood scale buildings like duplexes and triplexes in areas where it makes sense. We want to provide a set of tools so that that could be applied in areas or communities that want that option. And then, of course, use standards that allow for walkable mixed-use development. That's just going to be fundamental across all the districts. We want to make sure that walkability and mixed use is really inherent in all of the districts in the new code. And as a closing on this piece of tools, and we'll get into this a little bit later, I would just want to give a brief example of what zoning maybe isn't, that would be more of a design standard. So Greenville has a lot of design standards for the downtown and a lot of the historic districts. And I think this district that we're illustrating in this image is actually a great example. So zoning would control things like requiring garages to be in the back or the side of the building so that it's, you know, not on the front facade. Zoning could even require that you have an entry element like a porch or a stoop. But what zoning won't do is control things like what the architectural style of that porch is, or the materials used in that, or the color palette. That is more a design standard. So just want to be clear, and we'll have more conversations about what that distinction is. So think about zoning as sort of the massing and the placement of where elements are happening on site, and then more of the design standards are things like materials and architectural style. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Larry and Thomas and Beth. I'm sure we've got some great questions lined up.
Hey, Thomas, go ahead.
I have no additional information. I think we are open to any questions, or if there are any discussion topics from the public or anybody here.
Let's just do a quick recap here, Thomas, while we give people a chance to ask their questions. Once again, this is coming directly out of GVL 2040, and you gave Greenville props a few minutes ago for very quickly moving from concept and vision into action and putting this in place, frankly, while the priorities are still fresh. The priorities of we want green space, we want open space, we want a city that is better connected with better public transportation. And as we grow, we want to make sure that there are still affordable housing options for people. You know, we hear that over and over and over again, you know, people being pushed out by housing costs. As a city, there's a big piece of this affordable housing component of requirements within city limits. And so, you know, I really am excited that this code is that document that is going to kind of hold public leaders to these priorities. So, yeah, that's exciting, right? And then I see a question here. So if you want to add, I'll read over the question, then ask it back to you here in a second.
Sure. Yeah, I think you hit on something that's really important. So the code is a technical document, and it has the opportunity to help us understand where and how we want to incentivize housing and affordable housing in particular. It has the opportunity to help define open space, setbacks, park space, etc. Another priority within the code, as well as identify nodes. Nodes were identified within the comprehensive plan for future development at higher densities. Those areas offer the density needed and or required for additional transportation alternative options. And so a code, as technical as it is, as wonky as it does sound, it does provide the opportunity to take the vision, to take the goals and put it into a document that can actually be implemented. So that's exactly right. It has the opportunity to touch all three of the city's priorities.
Awesome. Okay, so Thomas, we've got a great first question. I know we've got some city planning staff on the line as well, so I might let them jump in on this one if this is not something that you folks can answer. But I do want to remind people I know we have a ton of engaged people in our community who are on this, and so this is your opportunity to get your questions, and please use the chat box to type in your questions. But Michael Day is curious about the infill ordinance that I think is going to Planning Commission tomorrow, and wants to know how that will align with this work here. And I think, you know, infill is certainly something that is a piece of how we can grow, right?
Absolutely. And so I think that as we dig deep into the zoning ordinance, we know that there are going to be hopefully opportunities where there are infill opportunities, where there are potential lot split opportunities. Again, that does a couple of things. It diversifies the neighborhood in terms of housing product offered, and it also can provide potentially smaller housing or housing that may be more affordable. So it starts to aim toward the direction of GVL 2040. And so this seems like a very logical step as a temporary infill ordinance as we get to the end of this year, tying it into the new code as well.
Wonderful. This may be a question for Larry or Thomas. Just asking for some examples of previous communities that you've worked with where they were able to achieve this benchmark of 10% on affordable housing, and what that looks like, and how you encourage that. And are you able to provide examples? Are you able to talk about how that is accomplished?
Yeah, I can provide a little bit of input, and I know there's a couple of others on the line that may have some other examples. But the challenge with South Carolina is that that the state statute does not allow for inclusionary zoning. So there can't be a requirement of, say, 10% of a new development that is affordable housing, but we can start to incentivize. Maybe that's with density, maybe that's with height, maybe there are economic development incentives or tax abatements or other incentives where we can start to incentivize it. So while we don't have the opportunity to guarantee inclusionary zoning as a part of the code, just because of the South Carolina state statute, we could start to incentivize it. Other communities that we have worked in along the Oregon coast, for example, they have started to incorporate housing trusts into some of their planning efforts. Again, not a requirement, but the idea of raising monies, connecting a housing trust to some of the efforts going on within City Hall can begin to provide incentives to developers. And that's not unlike some of the housing trust efforts that are actually going on with Greenville. So that may be a very nice link to tie the trust efforts to the code. So those may provide some opportunities. In other opportunities, some of the resort cities out west, whether it's Park City or Aspen or some of the communities in Idaho, they can require 10 or 15% affordable housing for new developments over a certain scale. And so for them, it's very, very easy. We'll have to work a little bit harder to find partnership approaches, et cetera, to make sure that it happens. But we're seeing that in other communities, as I mentioned, on the Oregon coast. Charles or Matt or Christy or Larry may have some other really good examples as well.
I would just say it's important to recognize that the value and cost of land on the market at various stages of development, from greenfield all the way through to redevelopment. Land costs have to be, by our calculation, close to $4 million an acre for a developer to reasonably get to the 10, 12, 13% threshold. So Greenville's a long way off from in my estimation, from being able to just assume that the market can close that gap all by itself. So what Christy said earlier, 4 or 5 slides ago, 2 or 3 slides ago, actually is key, which is the extent to which a zoning code is somewhere between hitting an aspiration and a by right is a delta that's covered through an incentive, through a set of incentives. So Thomas alluded to a few of them, which could be in the form of density or height, but they also include, cash that has to be there to make up the difference. So no one should be under the impression that because GVL 2040 says we want fill in the blank, and the zoning code says, and here's how you might regulate that ipso facto you get that. Somebody has to write a check for the difference. While the real estate market is very strong in Greenville, it still has a ways to go for the development by itself to be able to hit that 10, 12, 13% mark. So that plus what Thomas alluded to earlier, which is South Carolina being a Dillon rule state and having an explicit prohibition against inclusionary, means a number of tools are going to have to come into play together to meet the GVL 2040 affordability aspirations, not least of which is pushing the value of land up.
And I would add to that as well that, every community, big and small, is asking this question right now across the U.S. Affordable housing is a critical issue. And I'm excited that Greenville's talking about it. There are a lot of communities that aren't. And the reality of it is that it isn't an issue that's solved with one solution, one silver bullet. So, the 10% or 15% affordable housing isn't going to all be achieved in large scale multifamily, for example. And it won't all be achieved by infill. It's what communities have found is that having a suite of tools is really crucial to be able to chip away at this affordable housing issue. And that has other benefits for the community as well. It means that, you know, people with different needs, whether it's a family that needs affordable housing, they have different needs than maybe a single person that needs affordable housing. And when you have a suite of tools that provides different types of affordable housing in different places at different scales, then it gives people options. And that also means that there are some benefits to even homeowners. So, for example, a tool that has worked well in Atlanta is the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. So, you know, homeowners are able to have a renter, and that's extra income for them. Or maybe someone can retire to the accessory dwelling unit and then have their kids move into the main house. And so this question of an affordability, it's really a toolkit. So relying on one solution hasn't worked for a lot of communities, and people have found that the flexibility and having a suite of tools is really crucial.
And this is
Accessory
not
dwelling something I know is something that is definitely going to be considered in all this. I'm glad you mentioned it, Christy. Sorry for cutting you off there, Larry.
And this is not the last time that we'll be talking about affordable housing. I can guarantee you that. It's very clear that Greenville is losing a lot of its population, particularly Black and minority populations. It's clear. The census is very obvious and very clear about that. We're going to have to work, as Thomas mentioned, we're going to have to work very hard to try and make sure that affordable housing is available because of the statutes that don't allow us to allow you to require it. We are going to have to work extra hard, which is going to mean working with the suite of tools that we have and working with whatever cash the city of Greenville is going to be able to come up with to help underscore some of those incentives and to make sure that affordable housing is available. Greenville has an image throughout the nation of being a forward-looking city that takes care of its own. Now it's going to have in real time the opportunity to prove that. And we're going to see it through this process. I'm very positive. I'm very optimistic about that. From what I've seen from Greenville so far, it's stepped up to the plate and it's done what it needs to do. And I'm sure that it'll do that as it moves forward.
Thank you, Larry. I know that again, council has committed a lot of funds to that. There's been land donations and certainly some wonderful partnerships as well that keep this going. So let's ask a few more questions here quickly. Corey wants to know if form-based codes are being considered. I am not a planner, so I don't necessarily understand that question. So if somebody from the planning field could pop in and talk about form-based codes and if that's something that's being looked at.
Christy or Lee, do you guys want to touch on that a little bit?
Sure. Lee, I don't know if you want to have an opportunity to jump in here. I'm happy to answer that.
Looks like you're up, Christy.
Great, I will do that. So form-based codes, strictly a form-based code isn't exactly what we're thinking of here. It's more of a hybrid approach. What we do generally take from the form-based code world are the ideas of looking at the form of a building, being very design oriented and being very concerned with how the building addresses the public realm. Those are a lot of tools that we talked about in this presentation. With it, you know, being more of a hybrid approach, you know, sometimes form-based codes tend to only look at form. We will also be looking at use. So trying to sort of break those pieces apart a little bit in the code, you know, and a good example that we like to give for that is, you know, just because it's a house, you know, sometimes like Augusta Street, for example, has evolved over time where some businesses now operate out of a house form. And so that's a good example of how sort of form and use aren't always aligned as they are in a conventional code. And so in a more hybrid approach, we're able to accommodate some of that nuance and some of that character that already exists. So while, you know, we wouldn't say we're taking a strictly form-based approach, we are taking the pieces that are more design-oriented and concerned with the private realm and putting those into more of a hybrid code.
Christy, thanks. We've got a great question here from Diane Smock, a former city council member and a key person on the steering committee for GVL 2040, asking how will the character of historic neighborhoods be protected and enhanced in the new code, and wants to know if residents will have the opportunity to participate in kind of developing some of those rules that apply to their neighborhood. So two-part question: preservation of historic neighborhoods and their character, and then resident involvement in the process.
I could jump in and note that we anticipate that there are historic districts that will have their additional design guidelines, their historic district design guidelines, their character design guidelines that remain in place. There's some of those exist now, and we anticipate that those will likely remain in place because, to Christy's point earlier, design standards aren't typically, at that level of detail, are not typically part of a code. And so those would likely remain. And with regard to the residents, absolutely, we will be reaching out for resident participation and involvement in all of the zoning efforts throughout the community, historic districts, neighborhoods, and commercial districts. Christy, did I miss anything there?
No, that was great. I think, Charles, did you have a point you wanted to add?
Just it's important for everyone to realize that as character is preserved, there is a probability that desirability is increased. And as desirability is increased, demand is going to go up. And as you have a finite supply of highly desirable preserved historic character, prices go up. And so you have two conflicting ambitions. You have an ambition in GVL 40 for affordability, and you have an ambition in GVL 40, or at least expressed a moment ago, for preserving neighborhood character and historic character within that, right? So it's a word to the wise is to understand that a lot of the art of writing a zoning code is to toggle those competing ambitions. And that's what you should look for as a community. So going back to Beth's question 45 minutes ago, why should I care? It's be on the lookout for how those competing goals are in tension with one another, how they're balanced, how they're toggled, and how they get manifest in the code.
That's fascinating, Charles. It kind of falls in the unintended consequences category, right? You know, both things are important, but in some ways they're competing interests.
It kind of runs the parallel to open space preservation. The more land you take off the market, the reduced supply, yet demand remains high, costs go up, right? And so it is a similar comparison, but yeah.
Yeah.
And Beth, if I may add,
Yeah.
Thomas and I were working years ago in Utah, and a fascinating conversation at a planning commission hearing arose when the issue that Thomas alluded to, open space preservation and view shed preservation, was on the table. Mm-hmm. And so there were public bonds being debated to be applied to open space preservation, and what arose instantly was the recognition on the part of members of the Planning Commission and City Council that, oh my goodness, every time we make this place better, it gets more expensive. Maybe we'd better be thinking about those consequences. And so, Beth, exactly to your point and Thomas's point, that's a lot of what's in tension here. Yeah,
people keep saying, can you make people stop moving to Greenville? And at the same time, they say, hey, can we get new retail stores in and more restaurants? And, you know, so again, all these conflicting things. Have a great question from somebody here who, let me go back and find your name. I apologize. Phil wants to know, I guess kind of, will things be grandfathered in essentially? Will this be retroactive, or will the new set of proposed zoning standards update things?
I can take a stab and start at that. I don't know that we know the answer to that, the in terms of specificity, in terms of districts, et cetera, exactly what remains and what changes. Our understanding is that we will take a look at every district and make recommendations. And so I don't know if Lee or Christy have any specifics, but we're just beginning that work right now. And so I think it's still slightly to be determined, but we are looking at every district and improvements and updates in terms of this kind of hybridized zoning district approach.
Next good question here. The city working on a sustainability plan at the moment as well, wants to talk about how that might fit in, things that are environmentally friendly, future needs, electronic charging stations. Will that play a role in any of this?
Absolutely. I think, you know, some of those things to be considered are things like the EV charging stations, for example. You know, some of the tools that we've used in the past are things like you can provide an EV charging or an EV charging adaptable, so you don't have to put the charger in immediately. And maybe you get more credit for that. You know, maybe that counts as 2 parking spots, for example. So there are some incentives like that that can be built in. And, you know, things that are an overlap where zoning, and then as some of the stormwater ordinances are getting rewritten as well, are things like the streetscapes and understanding how those engineering and those green stormwater facilities can integrate well with the streetscapes. And so we will be open to hearing ideas and opportunities for adding in some of those sustainability issues and making sure that they're at least not conflicting with the zoning ordinance.
I've got a question here that I can actually answer. So I'm going to take one really quick. A question about what are our outreach methods for the residents who don't typically attend civic events or forums, who might not typically be involved in this or be on social media. So long story short, I was a missionary kid who grew up in Southern Africa in a socialist country where they did not have freedom of the press. And it has been my lifelong dream to be in the business of equity of information and make sure that information is accessible to all. So that is a question that is near and dear to my heart, and something that we work really hard to do is make sure that people of all backgrounds and all neighborhoods have access to information. So one of the things that we've just launched here at the city is a free texting service for all of our neighborhood presidents. We have about a dozen neighborhoods signed up already. That's a tool that neighborhood leaders can use to directly reach their residents. It's also a tool that people who have opted in, you know, that the city can reach out to them directly as well, understanding that while there may be people without internet, most people do have one of these, do have a phone, and that if you can get something by text, and if you've opted in, and if it comes from a trusted source, that being your neighborhood leadership, it is something that absolutely might captivate your attention. So in addition to that, you know, using the community centers that are in some of our special emphasis neighborhoods as gathering places and information points, also recognizing that printed materials might need to be distributed in some neighborhoods. We have recently employed in our communications department very specifically 2 people who are bilingual, with the recognition that the Hispanic population is growing here in Greenville and that translation is required to get the right kind of input. So I won't take up too much of the planning meeting talking about my comms philosophy, but the bottom line is we've got a plan. We are dedicated to reaching all residents who speak all kinds of languages of all different incomes. Folks who may or may not have been engaged in the process before. We're going to go out and we're going to do our best, because it's important to me as a communications director, and it's important to City Council to get that feedback. Okay, let me ask somebody wanting to know again about the GVL 2040 goal, preserving open space. How is this going to advance that up to 33% of remaining vacant land in the city? How do we talk about these competing interests again, but how do you balance this GVL 2040 goal with the preservation of open space and remaining vacant land?
So certainly part of the GVL 2040 process was to identify areas of vacant land throughout the community. And so as we look to overlay the zoning code, we have an opportunity to put minimum open space requirements for future subdivisions. We'll have an opportunity to capitalize on the recommendation in GVL 2040 that is to build out 9 to 11. We're looking at about 9 nodes now, areas where we would consider allowing additional densities and additional heights. With that additional density, with that additional height, we can start to save some ground space. So there is a trade-off. Again, there's an internal trade-off now that we're discussing, right? If we have a node and we want to allow additional heights, one, to make it more, to give more opportunity for potentially affordable housing, et cetera, we also can take some of the development off the single story or 2-story ground level area and save ground, preserve open space down there. So as we look at the nodes that have been identified in GVL 2040, part of our challenge in coding for them is to ensure that those nodes with more density preserve more open space, go up in terms of height. A discussion and a trade-off to be had there.
Yeah, we've got 2 minutes left, so time for one more question, but I just want to confirm that our planning team is capturing all of these questions and that we will use these to form a Q&A that we can put on this website. We're not going to let questions go unanswered, so if you've put something in the chat, we will make sure that we either get back to you directly or use your question on the website. But one final question here, any plans to reduce the amount of Greenville that requires single-family housing? Many cities have removed these zoning requirements. Is that an option in this code rewrite?
Lee or Chris, do you want to take that or want me to?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off. This really ties back to that affordable housing question that we were talking about previously. And of course, one of the things that we're talking about are accessory dwelling units and the flexibility that has to provide in a context-sensitive way some additional dwelling units in a lot of these existing neighborhoods, and particularly in a way that is very gentle. And a piece of this also is looking at some of those neighborhood scale, sort of small apartments or house scale, duplexes, triplexes. There may be some neighborhoods that say, hey, I want to be able to allow some of those again. They exist in some of the historic neighborhoods, and so re-allowing some of those typologies is something that, that's going to be a big conversation that we're going to want to have with the community and see where they would like to see maybe re-allowing some of those typologies. And so a lot of what we're doing right now is just thinking about the tools, building those districts to make sure that as neighborhoods start to have that conversation, that the tools exist in the ordinance for them to be able to implement them. And so that's how we're approaching that right now. It's very closely tied with the affordable housing question.
Christy, thank you. We have run up against the 6 o'clock time wall here. I'm going to remind folks that you can go to greenvillesc.gov/devcode. greenvillesc.gov/devcode. That is the web page that we're using to house documents. Thomas, Christy, Larry, Charles, everybody from CZB, thank you for doing this. As Larry mentioned, this is the first of 12. As we talked about the communications plan earlier, not only are we doing the e-blasts, we are doing these Q&A sessions once a month, doing lots on social media, using the neighborhood texting service. We want to make sure that the community has as many opportunities to learn and participate as possible. So thank you all so much for doing this. I felt like this went really well. I learned a lot. Thank you so much, and we will look forward to answering these questions online and seeing you guys again next month.
Thanks, Beth.
Thank you. Have a great night, everybody.
Have a great night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.